All right. I think that we are now in session. I'm looking at the participant list filling up. And where did your world come from was kind of an interesting topic for me because there's a whole bunch of things about world building, and I'm not quite sure that this is that panel.
No, this is, I don't know, maybe I'm in the wrong panel. This is sanctuary moon tracing. I don't know what that means.
No, I think the panel title was Where Does Your World Come From? Joe, why don't you start by introducing yourself? We'll give Aliette last. So that,
Okay, my name is Joe Haldeman, and I have written dozens of books, and I basically have a modest technical background. I have a bachelor's degree in physics and astronomy, and so I can do the calculus and all these fairly undergraduate calculations necessary for writing hard science fiction. And I taught at MIT for 30 years, so I know how to explain things to undergraduates and some graduate students who don't bring too much intelligence to my classroom. And basically, I've been writing all my life, really since childhood. And so I've been writing about 70 years, and I taught for 30 of them. And basically, I don't know, it would be interesting to pretend that writing is a totally intellectual exercise, which can be taught.
it is, sort of.
Most of us don't really believe that. And if it were so, it would be a job that you could study for and do. And it isn't.
It's a little bit more experiential. Tobias.
Hi.
Introduce yourself.
Tobias. That's all right. I'm Tobias Buckell, Caribbean-born science fiction fantasy author of 15 novels so far and 120 or so short stories that have been lucky enough to be in print. And I'm looking forward to being on the panel.
Fine.
Aliette?
Hi, I'm Aliette de Bodard. I'm a writer of science fiction fantasy. I've written novels and short stories as well. I like food, putting the Vietnamese in space, and dark gothic moods, apparently, for some weird reason to do with my education.
I'm Michelle Sagara. I'm your moderator today. Let's see how moderate the moderator is. I've written books as Michelle Sagara and as Michelle West. I have not been writing for as long as Joe Haldeman. I'm suitably impressed. Okay. We've cleared the introduction. I want to actually ask people a little bit of a question about literally, the panel question is, where do your worlds come from? And what I'm sort of curious about, and anybody can break this, anybody can comment in chat as well, it's really hard to moderate if you cannot see an audience. Like you can't tell, okay, we have to move things along now, or okay, people are interested. Like it's really hard. Obviously there's a lot to do with world building, right? It isn't, as they said, just plop a panel in a habitable zone. But what I'm curious about is what causes you, we're going to start with Joe again, to choose the worlds that you're building. Are there choices that are not about the viability or the suspension of disbelief viability, but are there other reasons that you choose or chose to build the worlds in which your books are set?
Well, okay, there are two basic categories. One is when you have total freedom for the invention of your world. And the other is when you have been given a situation that you have to make into a story. Why don't we not even discuss that one? Because that's more or less commercial consideration. And that's
Which
not
is what publishing is, though, right?
Yeah,
But yes.
that's a trade that you learn. Okay.
Mhm.
The more interesting one is how do you make a believable world within a fantasy or a science fictional context, which is what I think we're interested in. Because world building is something that all fiction writers have to contend with. But the mundane world building is perhaps interesting, but not that interesting to our audience. When you're building a science fiction world, you deal with what we know about astronomical situations and things having to do with space travel and living in a technological situation. What the visual aid that I was going to bring and which I carefully put someplace that I then lost.
Who has not done this?
Yeah, is the basic textbook, which is called Habitable Planets for Man. Do you all have that, or is that
I don't.
no longer?
I don't either.
No.
Well, it basically it was made by a Caltech scientist who said, "Okay, you're a science fiction writer and you want to build a planet. How do the various parameters, geological, astronomical, and so affect the writing?" And then you go from that into how do you build a sociological world that's convincing. What I told my students the first day at MIT is most stories are about conflict, and most science fiction stories, since they have to be a reason to be science fiction, involve a conflict that is a situation that is given you by the conditions of the story. And sometimes those are astronomical. That is to say, oh my, you're on a planet orbiting a tiny little cold dwarf star, so that's going to obviously affect how you dress. But there are more interesting ones too. And basically, the practical thing writing as a science fiction writer, I know you sit down there and you've got the blank page, which is maybe a screen, maybe a piece of paper for me. And then you just try to fiddle with it. What can you change? What can you make odd that the person has to deal with? And believe me, if you're just a plain writer, there's enough odd about the human condition that you don't have any shortage of stories to write. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, no. I am thinking about this. I'm going to talk about myself for 2 minutes. The reason I'm asking the question is somebody and I was talking about world building and talking about one of my fantasy worlds, and they said something, and I said, "Yeah, that's not why I did it." And they looked at me funny, and I said, "Look, what I was interested in at the base before I built the society was, I want a country in which the nobility is actually respected, not just because they have power."
Oh.
So there has to be something visible. There has to be some price that power pays that makes people who want power understand that they're not willing to pay that price personally to have it. And so the entire hunter culture comes out of the idea that I kind of wanted a nobility that held power not just out of fear or arms, but out of the respect of the people they ruled in general. Mm. So when I say what is the impetus behind the world, I mean, I should admit up front that I do not world build for fun, right? So I build a world that will contain the elements of story that I want to highlight. And the question of respected nobility or power was one of them. I mean, in another one, I'd said to somebody else, well, I did this so I could have a modern world. And it was actually Kate Elliott. And she looked at me and said, your version of modern is not modern. And I said, no, I wanted there to be a good and evil that mapped with our world, but it was a fantasy world. So there were certain considerations morally that had to be built in. Anybody else? Toby, Aliette, when you are sitting down to break story, do you do the world first? Like, do you have a world and then you write a story in it? Or does the world come out of the demands of the story that you think you're telling until, you hit page 30 and you realize, oh my God.
I saw Aliette lean forward, so I think.
Sorry, okay, hang on, it's my turn, sweet. I'm trying to slot this in between the moments where my very kind toddler is absorbed in the toy that I gave him. I generally have, thank you. I generally have a high concept idea that I will then flesh out. And then there's a sort of loop of like, well, I did the world building and now this in turn affects the plot, right? So when I wrote Tea Master and the Detective, I was like, I want to take the Sherlock Holmes character, this brilliant, abrasive, man who does not conform to the social norms of the Victorian era. By Victorian standards, like Holmes is like positively rude and positively completely blind to any kind of the social hierarchy that he's supposed to be respecting. And I thought, what if that person was a woman? And what if that... No, I'm talking now, okay? And give me... Yes, I'm talking. And I want... Okay. I wanted to take that person, make them a woman, and then put them in a Vietnamese analog setting. So I was looking for the closest equivalent to the Sherlock Holmes person, and I thought it's going to be a scholar, actually. It's going to be a scholar who writes those really weird treatises and those really weird memorials about like how corpses decompose in space, because that's what Holmes does, right? And in fact, the story is going to open with them walking in to the main character's room and going, I need a corpse, and it needs to be in space, and I need you to take me. And that's how I knew that the second character was going to be the spaceship. And then I sort of built the spaceship culture. After I had the spaceship, I was like, okay, so what does it mean to be a spaceship moving among humans? How do you talk to humans? How do you eat? Do you even eat? Do you? I'm fine, thank you. How do you like, meals are not only food, they're a social occasion, right? So how does a spaceship take part in social occasions and all that? So that's how I got the plot, basically. And then once I had secured the world building of this kind of series of habitats, Vietnamese setting, sentient spaceships, I sort of was able to have the mystery plot that was around it. So it was very much a sort of spiraling dive deeper and deeper into the, okay, this is the plot I want, but if I have this bit of world building, I can't have the plot quite that way. And then that takes it another notch down until we get to the finished product.
So for you, the world building and the world building and the story and the characters kind of influence each other all the way down?
Yeah, all the way down. Yeah, basically that's the way I do it.
Tobias?
Yeah, I mean, so like when we teach in workshops and when we try to talk about writing or give writing advice, we always separate these things out from each other. And I find it hard to disentangle them when I'm actually doing the work, right? Like where does setting begin and where does it end, and where does character begin and where it ends? I mean, they interlock. I mean, it's like a yin yang symbol. They're all intertwined with each other. And so I always think like we do a disservice when we talk about like, world building versus, characterization versus, like, they're not silos, right? It's all like, one messy canvas. So, for me, it's this it's much like Aliette. It's this thing where everything's playing off of each other as I go deeper and deeper, where, you know, if I'm doing research and I find interesting things about world, that can affect character. And if I need certain things to happen for characters or pressures to happen, you know, then I will start to adjust the world. I have done, though, 2 pieces that are very classically, like, you know, in the classic genre sense, world built. One was my third novel, Sly Mongoose, which is set in a sort of Venetian world, because I attended a astronomy lecture by Jeff Landis, who works at NASA, who kind of had this really great presentation on how the you know, upper atmosphere of Venus is very comfortable and habitable in terms of the solar system, you know, the honeymoon or the sweet spot, because once you're above the clouds, the pressure is like almost standard and the temperature is almost standard, and you have, you know, solar light, and coincidentally, if you were to fill a large city with air, it would naturally float because it's such a dense atmosphere. So he did all this work, and after the, you know, lecture, I kind of went up to him. I'm like, you've got to be writing a novel set in that world. And he was just like, no. And so I was like, well, can I?
I love it.
Because this is great stuff. And so I grabbed that, and the world influenced a lot of what happened in the plot and character, because I was a huge fan of submarine adventure. And the young boy, I don't know if you ever read these, back in the 30s and 40s, they used to be diving bell adventure stories where people would put on the heavy deep sea stuff and go and have an adventure and uncover gold from a sunken ship or whatever. They're not around anymore, but I was just like, oh, this is great. I have a realistic science fictional version to have people being dropped in pressure suits down to the bottom of this planet to look for stuff. And that's just like, you know, that all was world inspired. And then the next time I did it heavily with the world was my last fantasy novel, which is not yet published. It's still a work in progress, but I had burnt out on writing and was taking a 3-month break. I was going to take a 6-month break, but it only lasted 3. And, you know, sort of just trying to get my bearings back, and had started to just draw maps, which I never do. I don't start from the world and drawing the maps and all that other stuff like, you know, fantasy writers often are famous for doing. But I just spent like a month drawing these maps, and I would put them in, I would add layers, because you can use like Photoshop. You can put a layer over the first image. So I'd draw a map, and then I'd drop a layer of like changing political border lines. And then I had another map that was like subduction zones for where the hills and volcanoes would be. And then I had another layer that was for like religious, you know, various religions across the area. And then I had another map that was like trade routes and roads. And I just spent like a month doing this because it was just something to do that was creative, but had no story.
No pressure?
No pressure. It was
Right.
just me dinking around with maps and coming up with this. And it was just really creatively freeing. And then at the end of it, I was like, well, I can't have spent like 2 months drawing maps and not do something with that.
The type A personality, but I spent the time now. I have to leverage it. And it really is the type A personality. I understand, Joe, what you were saying. You have to make a world that seems coherent, that seems realistic enough, that readers can suspend disbelief. Absolutely. So I think there are levels to world building as well, like levels to the decisions that you make about the type of world. And different people approach it differently. Like, I hate maps. I can't even read a map. My youngest son said, "Why are you holding it upside down?" I said, "I'm oriented in the direction I'd be facing." And yeah, you're laughing. But so the idea of actually doing maps for fun fills me with existential dread. But I know a lot of fantasy writers who absolutely, when they've hit that burnout point, or when they've hit that middle of the book when everything is terrible and they don't know, you know, what was I thinking? Why did I think this is a good idea? They'll start for fun to do what you did. Let me just draw a map that's totally unrelated to all of the current pressure. and they start with maps. And I asked why, and they said, well, you need to understand the geology, you need to understand the environment to understand the economics that arise out of it, or possible economics that arise out of it. So I like to build worlds or maps first, and I'm okay. Well, I'm wandering off now to beat my head against a wall because maps, but I think that world building comes from many, many places. Joe, did you ever have an experience like Toby's where somebody started talking about something and that started a story or a story ideas just kind of popping?
I don't believe I have, but I don't have a very collaborative nature. My wife reminded me that I have done, because I wrote a book that was set in Hemingway's past.
But it was an idea from one of your students.
But it was an idea from one of my students. She says, and now I'm trying to recapture that memory.
The letters, the stolen letters.
Oh yeah, I was explaining to one of my students. He had driven me to the airport, and I told him about how Hemingway's first novel manuscript, was lost famously by his wife, who soon became his ex-wife, in a railway compartment in a train in France. And the loss of that manuscript was tremendously traumatic to him, and actually led to various characteristics of his writing, which I was trying to investigate in a novelistic way, of course. The book was called The Hemingway Hoax. And I explained this to my student, what had happened to Hemingway. And that's what led to the novel, because he was dropping me off at an airport, basically to go off to Australia. And on the plane ride, and on the island where I was staying before I went to New Zealand, I started writing this novel based on part of Hemingway's biography. This is actually only germane to a question of where do your ideas come from, which is
It is.
But there you go.
But world is, for me, you need a world in which to build a novel. It's just that question of, because what Toby pointed out, that they have different blocks. They have a world building block, and then they have other blocks, and it's not quite the way it works when you're actually writing. So I guess question number 3 for me would be, how much does the world change from the building of it? Like, do you use the world building as kind of, not blinkers, but a structural corset for the story?
Sometimes,
or,
yeah.
Aliette, Tobias?
My experience having written, I've written a, more or less classical fantasy series where it started in the world and it's still in the same world 2 books later, is that some of it does become constrained, right? There was a point when I said, look, that kind of magic cannot heal, and now I'm stuck with it, right? And then some of it was just left open enough that I could just push the world building a little deeper. So in the novels, I'm thinking about the Dominion of the Fallen trilogy, which is an alternate 19th century Paris, where you have houses which are magical factions. And there was one house in particular where actually even up to book 3, it wasn't really clear where the power was coming from in that house. And I wrote this kind of prequel short story where you had those creepy children of thorns that showed up in the house, and that turned out to be like the incarnation and the power of the house. And that had been brought up nowhere at all in the previous books.
But there was room for it.
But there was room for them, and it turned out to be key to the resolution of book 3, right? So very much a kind of, well, it works. Great. Sorry, I had a very slight favorite plush toy emergency. That's why I had to dip out. I apologize for the simultaneous truck running. But I mean, in my experience, there's it's not a course so much as like guidelines, right? And
Right.
like I'm kind of reminded of that Pirate of the Caribbean thing where, you know, everything is more like guidelines that you can break if necessary. Hey, sweetie, want to join us? You want to say hi? Okay, I'm here. Yes, and so I guess that's my feeling about it, which is that for me, it's like useful to have a kind of structure, but I don't feel bound by it in the sense of like, okay, now I've put down the law that is going to remain immutable for like the next 15 years, right? It's like, well, I've sketched this, and there's always room for like zooming in and showing you that actually the sketch might have been slightly misleading, or that it might not have been all there is to it, right?
Tobias, you know what? I'm pointing at your picture on the screen that I can see. How stupid is that?
Carl Schrader has this really interesting anecdote that he says, great author and friend of mine, and he talks about world building as being two different things, right? It's either kind of like the iceberg with the small tip over it, or he tells the story of a medieval tale of a person who gets lost in the woods, and he's lost in the woods for many days. He's starving, he's hungry, he's thirsty, and this beautiful woman kind of strides out of the forest and says, "Hey, are you suffering? Maybe I can help you." And at first he's kind of suspicious because, you know, strange, beautiful women walking out in the middle of the forest when you're lost is never a good thing in a medieval tale. But he's like, you know, he doesn't have any other choice. So he's like, all right, great, I'll follow you. And as he follows her, she walks backwards with her face always towards him, right? And that's kind of weird. And she goes into this little house and her face is always towards him. And she's like getting him food and stuff. And he's like really puzzled. And finally she turns around to tend the fire. And he realizes that there's nothing behind the face. She's just a mask, right? And Carl is like, that's one way you can world build, which is you're just trying to hold in front of the reader enough details that you are a mask that looks like a real, full human person, right? And that means you don't have to build the entire person. You just need to convince the audience that there's a mask, and yes, there is something behind here, but I'm not going to show you behind it. And then another kind of writer is the person who feels that like they don't want to risk having the audience see behind the mask, so they're just going to build an entire person, right? So that they can actually just have it there and not worry about, you know, having to figure out like how to keep moving in front of the reader so that suspension of disbelief isn't broken. And so I always think of that as a really great metaphor. And I think writers can use, you know, various amounts of the other, but that's always struck me as kind of a very interesting thought about it that Carl Schrader had.
Aliette, you write science fiction and you write fantasy. Do you find that there's a big difference in the approach that you take to world building?
No, honestly, no. I mean, science fiction has more science in it, basically, and fantasy has more magic in it. But I don't actually see a big difference between one and the other in terms of how I approach the world building. I think for me, it's a different kind of mood that I aim for, right? When it's fantasy, and a slightly different kind of plot, I would say, right? Rather than just having fundamentally a different process for both.
Tobias, do you find that when you do it?
Same thing as I you know, it depends on the project itself more than the genre. So some pieces are heavily bound in my reading a ton of history or, you know, sociology or things like that. And some of it's bound by just, I want to tell a particular story. So it's, you know, one of the things I try to make sure to do as a writer is try all the different methods. Like there are always these camps that are like outline versus, you know, right by the headlights. And I'm one kind of writer and I'm another. And I just kind of like, you know, I always like trying different things at different, you know, times to see if I'm still prefer one or the other. Because sometimes it's interesting to me that you change, you know, as time goes by or as the project needs. So sometimes I will throw myself at doing a lot of that work ahead of time because I just need the confidence to know that there's a world there that I can use. And other times I'm just sort of like, I'm very comfortable in this story and I'm going to make these details up as I go along. And as far as I can tell, readers, that, you know, some readers think the stuff I heavily think out ahead of time is like has a lot of depth to it. And some of them, you know, the stuff I research a lot ahead of time, they think like, oh, this doesn't have a lot of depth. And sometimes the stuff that I make up as I go along, people think has a lot of research and depth. And sometimes the stuff I make up as I go along, people think are light. So you know, readers are fickle.
Well, I wouldn't say they're fickle, but they're not all the same person, right?
Yeah.
So the person who really likes this is going to say you're brilliant, and you're thinking no. And the person who really likes that, you know, or people are going to say, well, you didn't even think about this, which is not true. But they're all different people.
Yeah.
And I try to keep that in mind when I'm in the state of extreme despair, because world building for me, as I said before, it's like map making. It's not something I do it's not fun. So for me, I jump in, I start writing, and then I hit a wall and I think, yeah, okay, now you got to go away and think about everything. But I'm always much more impatient to start. And I had like 200 pages of world building material that I'd forced myself to do all of for the West novels. And I revisited it at the end of or the middle of the third series set in the world, and things had changed. Like I was certain about things. I was certain about this. Well, what I'd written before I started actually writing the books with real characters was not quite what I remembered as the important things. So I don't know how much does the world building differ for any of you guys once you've actually got a novel? Are the details that you initially posited shifted a lot? Anyone?
Generally,
It depends on the world that you're working in, because in some worlds you can always just default to observable reality, and you don't have to explain anything. And that's the world that most people write fiction in. But in a fantasy or a science fiction world, you may have to explain certain things, and you may have to differ from observable reality and causality and whatever. Fantasy is interesting because you can tweak reality and go off into worlds of belief that are interesting and strange. When you do that in a non-fantasy novel, you're dealing with a kind of insanity that has to be described in other ways.
Mm-hmm. Or you have to have an actual scientific reason for the thing that is hugely different or doesn't conform.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I tend to work in worlds that devolve to observable reality, even fantasy worlds.
I would say that works for me, but I guess my observable reality would be people.
Yeah.
Human beings are going to be human beings. So the differences in their surface reactions tend to be the culture that you've set up. But even within cultures, I mean, I am not the same person as my mother, and we have a very similar culture. People are just people. So I feel that if the people coming from that place are solid and observable, then the world itself, not that it's less important, but I think a lot of readers read for people. So the thing that's interesting is how being in that world affects the people. But again, culture is not entirely separate from world, but
well, and I mean, a thing that I really find fascinating and that I tend to do in, you know, novel after novel is just having two people in the same world with a completely different worldview, like, you know, materially they're from the same culture and the same world, but they just happen to be, because of personal experience, because of social background, to just have a completely and wildly divergent view of things. I think the most I think it was in the House of Binding Thorns, which is book 2 of the Dominion of the Fallen series, in which you have a central character who's called Asmodeus, and who's seen through the eyes of like 4 different characters, and they all have a different perception of him because of different relationships to him. And I was very careful never to actually give him a point of view, because what I was looking for was the kaleidoscope of like everybody's got a slightly different idea of where they stand in regards to him. But I do that a lot in other circumstances. And I think it's just like, you know, everybody goes through life having a very different experience. And even,
Right.
you know, my sister and I, or my parents and I, have very different ideas and experiences. And it's just the interplay of like your culture, your personal background,
Right.
and your personality just is what I find fascinating in writing a character.
That's why I find the whole question of cultural things sometimes difficult. There's no monoculture. You can say this is a monoculture, but even within it, you put 10 people together in a room from the same monoculture, and you're going to get 10 different people the minute you
We
start.
have a question. Oh, sorry.
No, actually,
We
you're
have a
right.
question.
I just opened, and it was, how has your education work, non-writing work, and travel informed your world building? Who's in the hot spot? Actually, I think Tobias has to answer that one. Because
You pointed it out, you get to answer it.
All right. So that's a great question. I would say that one of the great big, impacts on world building has been the fact that I grew up outside of the U.S. I grew up in Grenada and the British and U.S. Virgin Islands eventually, and then came to the U.S. So, that background informs a lot of what I look for and how I, go digging for world building. People often comment sometimes, they're like, oh, this is definitely a Tobias Buckell, science fiction or fantasy story because it focuses on this. If there's a high court, high fantasy, Toby's going to not ever show the rich people on the inside, kind of deviously doing things, but it's going to start with someone emptying the slop bucket almost always, right? I don't know. I just, those stories are interesting to me. And as far as like the travel, yeah, that has a tremendous impact, because I have an outsider eye. I see the U.S. from outsider eyes in a lot of ways. That impacts a lot of my work, I think, and goes to my world building and goes to the choices I make. Quite often, someone pointed out that quite often I use political entities or worlds that are small in a very large universe with large entities battling it out, which makes sense, seeing as that I came from an island.
Aliette, do you want to try to answer that one?
I think it does affect everything that I write. How it affects everything that I write is kind of like trying to work out, why the air I breathe is the air I breathe, right? It's kind of I'm like Tobias in the sense that I didn't grow up outside of the US, so I perceive that difference, but I'm also, half Vietnamese, and I write in English as my second language, and so there's a whole host of things that I can see in my background, and then there's a whole host of themes that I can see in my writing, and how does that map? Certainly there's a fascination with the liminal in my work that you can definitely map to the being diaspora and coming from a different cultural background, but I'm not too sure, all of it is a one-on-one mapping, because that would be far too simple. So for me, it's very much a, yes, I'm definitely sure it's happening. And I couldn't tell you exactly which bits come from where with absolute certainty. I can give you a few pointers. I can, okay. I believe we've been given a warning. My fascination with the aftermath of war and the effect of war on civilians certainly comes from the family background with the Vietnamese American War, right? But it's complicated, basically.
Yeah, there's no direct mapping. So a lot of these questions have a kind of, it's like there should be a one-on-one mapping to them, but there isn't. Joe, did you want to answer? Take a shot at it?
I was going to say that's an interesting place where our fictional and actual worlds intersect, because mine would be Vietnam too. but I was there as an invader and as an alien in place. And most of the most dramatic things that have happened in my life happened to me in Vietnam.
Right.
Even though that's many years ago and was only a few months out of my life, still it's the only time I've ever killed people or been around people dying. And, most of my life otherwise has been pretty ordinary. I sit around and write, and that's all I've ever done. Even when I was a college professor, I mainly wrote and taught.
Does anybody in the audience have any questions? There are two ways to ask. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there'll be a Q&A. That's where Tobias saw the question. And also there's chat on the side.
Don't all jump in and ask questions at once.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating just how hard it is to pin a definite answer on this. And like the further along I get in my writing journey, the less helpful my answers are, like usually the first thing that comes out of my mouth is, it depends.
That's a good answer for almost everything.
Well, it is, but it's I guess it's kind of hard because when you're trying to teach something, this is why, by the way, I don't think I could ever be a writing instructor, because there are no true writers I know who work the same way. And there are even people like you, that would be Tobias, I'm pointing at you now, who try and experiment. Try and experiment with different processes. I find process fascinating. But I have no two writers who approach process the same way. So I'm terrified sometimes that, when someone's just starting out, they'll say, but I really like your books, so what you're doing works. And you have to explain that what I'm doing works for me, but this might totally destroy anything that you write. Like, you don't know until you find a way to get from page 1 to the end, what process will work to get you there. So the world building one was interesting because so many people, they have the how to build worlds, how to start with this and make it believable and do the premise. But I think Tobias is right. That overlap, that spiraling is sometimes missing from those. So when I first started out, it was like, okay, I have to do world building because I'd heard this, but I had to tell you, my very first 4 novels, it was like, can I start my book yet? Can I start my book yet? Like, it was just, the only thing I really liked were the ancient little bits of history and legends and myth, but actually working those out made me really want to start the book. And I eventually thought, no, okay, screw this, I'm starting the damn book. So I will bounce back and forth. Okay, now I need to know what this is. Or now I need to understand what the main characters understand. I took off 3 months to research armies, the provisioning of armies, because I suddenly realized that my characters are generally smarter than me, but I have to know the stuff. And so I asked my husband, big wargamer, big historian, hey, how do you provision 50,000 people? Like, I mean, how do you to feed them? I mean, if they're going to be on foot, they're walking 4 abreast, they're going to strip the countryside. How do you do this? And he said, and all of the books that I found easily were just about battle strategy, not logistics. And I went everywhere. You'd find a paragraph here, you'd find a paragraph there. Even the historians, half of the historians I knew were very big on strategy and the actual battle, but maybe it's because I'm a mother. I don't care. If you can't feed those 50,000 people, they're all going to go rogue and they're marching through your country first. So, we have another warning. So let me there are now 4 Q&A questions. Has the pandemic situation this year changed how you will approach world building in the future?
Well, I mean, I've got a sense of like, what it's like to be cooped up with just 3 other people for 6 months. So that'll affect my, people in a spaceship for 6 months stories, right? So far, we haven't suffered from space madness or killed each other.
Some of us have not suffered from cabin fever, which does not require spaceships.
Yes, if you were suffering from space madness, would you know?
Yeah, true.
Maybe.
I
I think
don't know if we can put a finger on how the pandemic is going to affect us yet. It's too early to tell, right? The story's not over. You know, like it'll affect us differently if it's suddenly over in a few months versus if it takes another year and a half. It's going to affect us differently if the US keeps doing it differently than like chunks of the developed world. It's going to affect some of us differently who are in the middle of that situation. It depends on how bad it will get. That'll affect us differently. There's just so many variables. I don't know. I'm just now grappling, with just the early stages of trying to think about what it means for just me as a person. It's too soon to tell, I think.
Yeah, especially when you're thinking in terms of world building, we don't know yet what kind of world is being built by these tensions.
Yeah.
And that will affect our writing and our living and our philosophies or politics. But the experiment has only started. We haven't seen the results at all.
right. Okay. So the answer to that one is it's inconclusive. I will say that I wasn't allowed to use the title for my finished cast book. The editor, art director, and another editor all thought it was a great and appropriate title for the book, but marketing said you cannot call a book Cast in Isolation. We want no isolation in the title. We want nothing that reminds people of COVID, which caused everybody to laugh and agree. That's not really world building. That's just unfortunate. All right, we have 2 minutes left. So I guess if we're doing these in order, world building in short fiction versus novels, ?
There's less of it to do.
No. Anybody? Obviously, it's different. I have to say, for me, the short story is a sketch. The world is a sketch, but I might want to return to it. It might bring up deeper issues, but it is much more sketchy. I don't spend 200 pages for the 30-page short story. Anybody?
I always end up doing the same amount, whether it's a short story, a novella, or a novel. So no difference for me.
No difference for you. Bill?
The short story may be concentrating about one aspect of how this world is different, and that is probably what the story is more or less about.
Right. Okay. So yes, there is a difference, but it's in scale. No, I don't think we have time for the last one. There is a chat. I don't know if all of you are in Discord at all. Okay, because they're using Discord as the hallway, the spillover hallway. So if there are still questions that people want to answer, but they're going to shut us down in a minute. Thank you all for watching. I'm really sorry. We're all new to this, all of us, and it's a different form of social media. And maybe in the hall in Discord. So if you have Discord, I don't actually. I think the moderator is going to, yes, there in the chat part, it'll say, join us on our Discord server after the panel ends, and it'll give you a link. So head on there if you have questions. I think that, as I said, it'll be like a hall discussion if there are. One of us, unfortunately, but I didn't have as interesting things to say, has to be on another panel, right in 10 minutes. But thank you, everybody. Okay.
All right.
We can all leave now.